Okay, now let's move on to the diversity of the kingdom Protista. So, basically, for the kingdom Eubacteria and kingdom Archaebacteria, this has been discussed, together with the discussion of the bacterial and archaeal cell structure. So now we will jump into the diversity in the kingdom Protista. So when we say diversity here, we are actually looking into the morphology, no, or the physical characteristics of Protista, but not on their genetic level. So nata sa tiyahang taxonomy, what we can see eventually. So to start, your kingdom Protista is actually a kingdom which is a catch-all basin for all organisms that cannot be categorized in other kingdoms. So in a sense, your kingdom Protista kay mura siya basurahan sa inyong life forms nga lisod kaayo i-categorize as animal, plant, fungi, no, or bacteria or archaea. So katong mga organisms na dili jud silang unsa ni ma-classify as such, and they are unicellular in nature or colonial in nature, then they would end up with the kingdom Protista eventually. So they do lack common evolutionary heritage because, again, these are quite varied organisms that are coming from different, branches of the tree of life. So eventually, wala jud sila commonalities, when it comes to their evolutionary relationship. Historically, your kingdom Protista is divided into three particular branches or three groups. So you have the early forms of animals, which are named protozoa. You also have the early forms of plants, which are the protophyta. And you have also the early forms of fungi, which is the protomycota. So, katong mga organisms na dili ka ng animals, but they are non-photosynthetic, they are under the protozoa. Those kanang organisms which are photosynthetic with cell wall but are not plants, they are under the protophyta. And those non-photosynthetic with cell wall but are not uh, categorized as fungi are actually under the protomycota. No? So ang katong mga salin-salin sa inyong kingdom fungi, plantae, and animalia, diri pa dong sa protista. No? So they have one particular universal characteristic of your kingdom Protista is that they lack higher cell organization. For example, they are not multicellular in nature. So all your Protista are actually unicellular, but some are colonial in nature. So when you say colonial, the cells are found or living together, as a community, but they are not resembling a single entity or a single organism. No? But they are living together. More such as populations, but not populations of multicellular organisms, but populations of unicellular organisms. No? A colony of unicellular organisms. And one particular major requirement for your protist is the presence of moisture, because your protist, just like your archaea and bacteria, these are unicellular. So therefore, the acquisition of nutrients and any other compounds from the environment is through simple diffusion and active transport. So they really need to have moisture or water to create concentration gradient. No? Kaya kung wala man boy concentration gradient, if you have isotonic environment, then there would be no movement of solutes or compounds or dissolved nutrients in your water. No? So it is essential for your kingdom Protista, representatives to live in an environment with ample amount of moisture. Now, your protists, since they are unicellular organisms, they can be found virtually anywhere. Anywhere basta na ay moisture. So it could be in the soil, even the air could have their cyst formation, um, food, no, in our water bodies, no, fresh water and marine. So virtually anywhere, no, you can eventually have proteins. And therefore they are maintaining balance in terms of the cycling of nutrients in our environment. No? So they are part of the detritivore population in the food web. They're also part of the nutrient recyclers as to where they convert organic matter back to inorganic forms. No? So proteins are very essential or very important in that matter, no? Ecologically speaking. Now, when it comes to their nutritional strategies, there are ample ways, no, for your proteins to gain, no, energy and get food. So one would be what you call osmotrophy, as to where the acquisition of soluble compounds are being acquired after the release of enzymes that degrades your dead organic matters in your surroundings. So your saprophytes, for example, no, in the form of pwede po kanang ciliates, no? Inyong mga tardigrades, no? These are actually saprophytic in nature because they release enzyme that would degrade the organic matter. So there is external digestion of these organic compound, and after the external digestion, kung kanang watery na or fluid na ang ilahang organic matter, then that's the time they can eventually kanang acquire these nutrients. No? So that's osmotrophy. So with the build up or the degradation of the organic compound or nutrients, they build up the kanang concentration of nutrients outside the cell. So eventually, through diffusion process, ang katong mga nutrients would eventually move towards the inside portion of the cell. No? So osmosis ba kumbaga, osmotrophy. You also have what you call holozoic nutrition. So in your holozoic nutrition, uh, this is the phagocytosis of a particular smaller unicellular organism or organic matter for them to acquire nutrients. No? Holo meaning whole and zoic meaning animal. So ilang kaon, holy, no? Kitone nila ang organic matter or a smaller cell, no? Through phagocytosis process. So that's holozoic, meaning this is heterotrophy in nature. No? Nikaon sila other organism. As opposed to what we call autotrophy. No? Auto meaning self, trophy meaning nourish. So they can nourish their own self because they can manufacture their own food with the aid of the presence of sunlight. So in this case, since they are making their food through sunlight, and this is what you call photoautotrophy. No? Um, um, Photo meaning light, so they can eventually manufacture their own food with the presence of light, as opposed to chemoautotrophy. No? Chemo meaning chemical, so they can manufacture their own food with the presence of chemicals in their surrounding environment. So wala po ni siya sunlight. But there are no known proteins that can do chemoautotrophy. No? Ang makadu sa chemoautotrophy are actually bacteria and archaeans that are found in the deepest portion of our oceans, no? Most especially in hydrothermal vents. No? Mo na sila ang environment na devoid of sunlight, but they do have ample amount of chemicals in their surroundings. Now, thus, chemoautotrophy. You also have what you call mixotrophy. No? Mix, meaning combine, gihalo. Kung sa'y gihalo, gihalo ang pagka-heterotrophic o ang pagka-autotrophic sa inyong proteins. So they can now eventually use organic matter, no, or CO2 as carbon sources. So if they are using CO2 as a carbon source, that means they can now photosynthesize. No? They have this particular autotrophic power. But if they are using organic matter as a source of carbon source, then these carbon organic matter are eventually in the form of glucose. So therefore, these are actually in a form of cellular respiration. So mixotrophy, meaning your proteins can either photosynthesize or they can either eat other organisms. So nakombine na ang inyong cellular respiration and photosynthesis, or being a producer and being a carnivore, no, in that instance. Now, when it comes to the external or cellular morphology of your protist, no, they do have the cell membrane, no, because all cells they do have cell membrane. But underneath the cell membrane, they have what we call the pellicle. No, your pellicle is a flexible proteinaceous layer, no, which is located just beneath the plasmalemma, or the same with your cell membrane. No, imuhang plasmalemma, cell membrane, kanang sa pa ni siya plasma membrane, no, pareha ra na silang tanan. They do refer to that external membrane that is covering our cell, no? So in your protist, underneath the cell membrane, they have what we call the pellicle, and these are quite flexible as opposed to the cell wall of your bacteria and archaea. They do not have the pellicle, but they have the cell wall, which is rigid. That's why the shape of your archaea and bacteria, they are kind of definite. But when you go to protists, since they have a flexible layer underneath the cell membrane, pwede nilang ma-change ang ilahang shape, no, or cellular shape. Um, the pellicle is a defining characteristic of many protozoans, no? And they act as a flexible armor that protects the cell without hindering the protist's movement. No? So unlike the cell wall, it's for protection, but it's not for movement. But here, pellicle can act as a protective layer, but also it aids in the locomotion of your protist. No? Another significant morphology that we can find in your protista, most especially for your ciliata, no, or those protists that are having many cilia, no, are the presence of what we call macronucleus and micronucleus. No? So, what's the difference between the macro and the micro? No, the difference there morphologically is the size. So, macro dako, ang micro gamay. But what's the difference in terms of their function? So when you say macronucleus, this is for the vegetative growth and gene expression of the protist. No? Um, so eventually, all of the cell's normal activities, no, metabolic chemical reactions, no, mga hydrolytic kanang functions of the cells are actually being kanang supervised by the macronucleus. But when you go to micronucleus, this is for sexual reproduction as well as genetic exchange during conjugation process. Okay, so conjugation means there is horizontal gene transfer or transfer of genetic materials from one individual to the next, but there is no production of a daughter cell. No? So conjugation is not really a reproduction kind of process, but there is an exchange of genetic material. So that's the main difference of your macro and the micronucleus. The macro for the normal activities of the cell. For your micronucleus, these are more on sexual reproduction, no, ng mga processes as well as genetic exchange, no, through conjugation process. Another would be the cytoplasm of our protist. No? The cytoplasm, unlike any other cellular types, they have the ectoplasm and also the endoplasm. No? So when you say ectoplasm, these are clear gel-like outer layer, more rigid compared to your, excuse me, compared to your endoplasm. No? So ang imuhang ectoplasm kanang transparent, clear, gel-like, no? And is more rigid compared to your endoplasm. And it provides structural support, no, to help maintain kanang cellular shape, as well as it also helps in the locomotion, no, just like your pellicle. Um, your ectoplasm also contributes to the movement, most especially for your amoeboid protist, no, kanang imong mga amoeba, which would eventually kanang create what you call pseudopod, no, or pseudopodia formation for locomotion. So since the cytoplasm, the shape there, as well as the cell membrane and the pellicle are kind of flexible, so they can now protrude some of the kanang sa ni cytoplasmic materials and the cytoplasm itself as projections for it to move from one place to another. So that's the very function for ectoplasm. So clear, rigid, and for cell shape and locomotion. As opposed to your endoplasm. No? So endoplasm, endo meaning inner. So this is the inner part of the cytoplasm of your proteins. And these are more fluid in terms of its consistency, no? Meaning dili siya gel-like, no? More watery siya. And it contains now the cells